So I invite you this morning to hold three pieces: a house of prayer for all people, a den of thieves, and body as temple of Holy Spirit. House of prayer for all people, a den of thieves, and body as the temple of the Holy Spirit. So in Jesus' time, the temple, if it was put end to end, would have been the size of 12 soccer fields. The temple was the size of 12 soccer fields put end to end. Can you imagine that kind of structure, how large that temple is, which is where our story is taking place today. So it's huge, right? It's enormous. So if Jesus would have turned over a table or two in his small area in this enormous temple, it most likely might have ruffled a few feathers around him. But if the practicality of it, well, it might have just gotten some folks' attention. And yet it's more likely that it was symbolic. So our task this morning is to learn what is the symbolic piece of it. What is Jesus asking us to pay attention to in this house of prayer for all peoples, this den of thieves, and this body as temple of the Holy Spirit? So at Jesus' time, the temple was many things, right? It was a house of prayer for all nations. It was where pilgrims would go on their pilgrimage for 3 different festivals. It was where the National Bank was, and it was the only place in the Jewish world where sacrifices could be offered. So therefore, there were vendors on site. There were all these animals on site that people would come to. They're traveling. This is a time of great joy because people are coming from all over the world to the Passover, all over the world in that area, right, for the Passover, to celebrate this. It's almost like a vacation. I don't want to call it a spring break, but it's sort of like that. Yes, they're coming to connect with their friends. They're coming to connect with people they haven't seen for a while. They're coming to come to this big city, and they also have that special connection with their fellow Jews and with God. It's them in this place together, and enter into this temple is Jesus. So can you imagine the energy shift? There's all this happiness, and here is Jesus who comes, and he's angry. He is angry that this house of prayer for all nations. Am I going in and out? Y'all hear me okay? This house of prayer, I am going in and out, or you can hear me okay? Okay, thank you, Nadzan. I'm okay, thank you. So this house of prayer for all people, right? The temple, that's what it is. The temple is a place that welcomes everyone. It welcomes Gentiles, it welcomes men and women, slaves, Jew, free people, rich people, poor people. In the temple. It is truly a place where everyone is welcome. There are many different languages that are being spoken. We need to be clear, there are parts of the temple, right, where there are boundaries, where Gentiles are not allowed. However, there is this sense that it is to be a place of love that encompasses all people. So Jesus has this righteous anger because he is wondering if this place truly is a house of prayer for all people. So the question for us today is Lynnhurst a house of prayer for all people? How are we doing with our hospitality? When people come in, do we greet them, or we say, actually, that's my seat, can you move a few pews away? Are folks coming because there's an ability for us to think differently? Or are we all having to think the same or have the same political notions? Yes? So are we truly a house of prayer for all people? And how are we doing living out our hospitality? I know we did the passing the peace a little bit different today, but the origins of passing a peace in church services were about if you had something where you were not at peace with your neighbor and you came in to worship, before you worship, you were to go to that neighbor and make peace. Otherwise, that would get in the way of you being able to worship your God. So instead of just coming into worship and going through the rituals, thinking that that would help you worship your God, being able to pass your peace with your neighbor and seek that reconciliation and redemption was part of what it means to worship God. Are you still with me? Yes? So I know that it's come into this nice, sweet little hi, how are you, good morning, and yet there's a depth to it as well that's connected to, is this a house of prayer for all people? So Jesus has this righteous, holy anger, and I'm sure you've remembered that the root words for righteous and justice are the same thing. So to be a people who are seeking justice means that righteousness as well, so that we're participating in tipping the world towards God's dream. And I'm aware as a woman how challenging it is to preach about righteous anger. Because we women throughout our days receive mixed messages on how we're to navigate best being likable and electable. We know that on one hand we are told to be nurturing and kind, and yet we don't want to show too much emotion, especially if we start crying, because that might make some folks uncomfortable. And yet on the other side, yes, we are to be excited, but not too fiery or passionate, because then that might be seen as anger. Those are tools, right, that are used by society and individuals when someone becomes uncomfortable with a woman's fieriness or passionate ability. We can then label and discard and dismiss her or him. And if we can label, discard, and dismiss, and someone's not worthy, then we can then legislate against them. Yet we're missing an opportunity to look below that labeling and that discarding and saying, I wonder what that anger is about. Our sisters of color especially have that. You don't want to be a fiery, angry black woman, right? Because then there's the immediate being discarded. Y'all probably watch some of the Democratic debates, right? Yes, when Elizabeth Warren got a little fiery, didn't she? Or Amy Klobuchar, what did we hear? Some intense discomfort. When Bernie Sanders got so intense, though, and he can get red-faced, he's just passionate, right? And someone that we can get behind. Elizabeth Warren said so beautifully, yes, when you mentioned that sexism was part of all of this, she said you're either seen as a whiner if you mention it, or if you don't mention it, you're seen as delusional. So again, that double standard, I'm aware of it. And what is below that, because we're people who are you all still with me? We're spiritual people too, right? So Jesus is talking about bodies as temple of the Holy Spirit. So if we're labeling folks and because we're uncomfortable or we have discomfort, if we're labeling, discarding, and dismissing, folks aren't able to live fully in their temples, in their bodies, because so much energy is being spent navigating the double messages. So there's a lack of an ability to live fullness in the temple. And that's part of the reason why Jesus had that righteous anger. Because Jesus is about fullness and wholeness, men and women inhabiting fully their beautiful, gorgeous bodies so that we can thrive and bring forth those gifts that God calls us to bring forth. So that's part of the challenge I needed to name, y'all, as I'm talking about righteous anger, holy anger. And there's another layer, too, when we speak and preach about anger. Many of us have been hurt by it. Many of us have been on the receiving end of someone's uncontrolled rage that sliced through us. Or maybe we've been the people who have done the wounding. We've lashed out and hurt, and we've wounded those people that we hold dear. So that's another challenge when we start talking about anger, because it's that type of anger that Jesus knows how hurtful and harmful that is when we're not able to look below it. I'm sure your therapist has told you this, right? That anger is a secondary emotion, that usually beneath that anger is some hurt or some fear. I think anger can stand alone on it as well. So part of what Jesus is naming, that ability to do that healing work that needs to happen in those moments as well. Y'all still with me? So Jesus has this righteous anger, and he makes a difference between that personal anger that hurts people, and he makes a difference between this righteous anger when there is an injustice happening and he is calling it out. So it is necessary for us to be angry at those systems of injustice, whether it's racism or misogyny, or we're seeing a whole lot of xenophobia that's happening these days with the outbreak of the coronavirus, that we speak out against. And it is supposed to bring up that fire in our gut, that can be a fire in our gut that leads to action against the injustice, not against the people or wounding. Yes, it's a fire against that injustice that is to motivate us. So part of the question that we think about as temples, each of us in our bodies, and all of our bodies being connected, part of our Lenten journey is both the inner reflection And y'all, this is where the Holy Spirit's been convicting me, because I just love Lent. And I think it's all about the inner reflection and the becoming. And here's where the Holy Spirit's been convicting me and saying it also needs to lead to that inner transformation that propels, that directs us outward to continue going up against those injustices that harm, so that we can continue creating that common greater good. So might that righteous anger then, part of our task is learning how then we use that fire to transform the injustice, to use that energy source not to attack people, but to attack the systems that keep us stuck, that keep us separated from one another. House of prayer for all people, den of thieves. All of us have those bodies where the Holy Spirit lives, and they are temples. Part of the reason why Jesus had his righteous anger was that worship was becoming just these rituals that meant nothing. Folks were going through the motions without it leading to that transformation. And Jesus had the righteous anger when he said, "You are making my temple a den of robbers." Den of robbers is a den of thieves. Den of thieves is not where robbers robs. Den really means cave, and cave is where robbers go after they have stolen or taken things, and they go to know that they can belong in their little cave and count up all their loot. The prophet Jeremiah says it this way: "Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal," who's a god, "and other gods that you have not known, and then come to stand before me in this temple, in this house which is called by my name, and say, 'We are safe,' only to go on doing these abominations?" So the present day comparison to Jeremiah and to Jesus is that throughout the work week, we cheat people. We treat our staff in really rude, horrible ways. We belittle, not that any of you do this, we belittle, or we are divisive, yes, in the staff team, or we might cheat a little bit on our taxes. So